Welcome to the Chase Challenge Week 13. Last week, we said goodbye to Joshua. He had led the children of Israel into the promised land, and last week's reading only spanned 25 years. This week's reading, we are introduced to a whole new generation of Israelites. 3 generations from the group of Israelites who had seen God's power in Egypt and had crossed the Red Sea. So we're to the 3rd generation. This period of time, this week's reading, spans somewhere between 300 to 400 years. And you need to know that this week's reading is not written in chronological order. It is all occurring during this period of time, the period we call the time of the Judges. So everything is happening during this period of time of 300 to 400 years, but not necessarily in chronological order. And some of these things are happening simultaneously. Let me give you a little preview of what to expect. First of all, like I said, you're being introduced to a brand new generation of Israelites. They are described at the beginning of this week's reading as a generation that does not acknowledge the Lord, abandons the Lord, and forgets the mighty works that he did in the past. Therefore, they can't see his mighty hand in what's happening. They abandon the God of their fathers, and the result of that was they began chasing after the idols and the way of life of the people surrounding them. You will be introduced this week to Moses' grandson, Aaron's grandson, and do you remember Rahab from the Battle of Jericho? We will also be introduced to her grandson. Now, it's not mentioned explicitly in this week's reading, so I'm going to give you a little insight. Rahab ends up marrying a man named Salmon. I want you to look for these grandsons of Moses, Aaron, and Rahab. And I want you to look and see who do they follow, what characterizes them. I think you will be a little shocked at what you find out about them this week. Now, this new generation of Israelites who abandons the Lord and the ways of the Lord, what did we learn last week would happen if they abandoned the Lord? Well, they wouldn't receive the blessings of the Lord. And because they did not follow God's instructions, God withdrew his power and his might, and the victories that they were experiencing under the leadership of Joshua because of God's power and because of his might were taken away. So this generation of Israelites resorts to new tactics because they do not have the power of God. So you will see a corruption in their war, in their relationships, and in their religion. So look for those corruptions. Compare and contrast how they're living now to how God instructed them to live. You see, God's purpose for the Israelites was to reflect him, his glory, his goodness, his holiness, but they rejected that. And they were reflecting everything but his goodness, his glory, his holiness. And you will see that this week. Now, Israel's rejection of God led them to spiral into these cycles of sin. Rejecting God, then, as a result, they become oppressed and enslaved by the nations around them. That leads them to them becoming desperate, becoming defeated, discouraged, and finally calling out to God and asking him for help. God always answered. He sends the Israelites a judge to rescue them from the oppression, from the enslavement, and to lead them during the lifetime of that judge more into the ways of the Lord. But then once again, the judge dies. The people abandon the Lord. They follow after the gods of the nations surrounding them. And that again leads to oppression and enslavement. That leads to desperation, defeat, discouragement, which eventually leads them to cry out to the Lord and ask him for help. The Lord answers, sends another judge. So you will see this cycle happening over and over again. You will be introduced to several different leaders of Israel, several different judges of Israel. They are not necessarily godly leaders, but nevertheless, They are used by God to rescue Israel out of the oppression and enslavement that they find themselves in. During the period of the Judges, a few different scenarios take place. And towards the end of this week's reading, you will be introduced to a few stories which may horrify and shock you. You will find in this week's reading one of the worst stories in the entire Bible. Horrific things happen during the period of the time of the Judges. Remember how I told you that Israel was not following the ways of the Lord? They were not reflecting the God who so desperately was chasing after them and who had so carefully instructed them in his ways, who so much wanted them to reflect his goodness and his glory. Well, Israel was reflecting everything but God and his glory. They had rejected his purpose for them. God's purpose for them was to be a blessing to every nation in the world, to bless the whole world through the Israelites, and they were doing anything but that. This is exemplified in a story that you will read towards the end of this week's reading. You will be introduced to an Israelite who is traveling through the promised land, and he decides not to stay in a certain town because it is not inhabited by Israelites. So he chooses to continue traveling and stays in a city that is inhabited by Israelites. You would think, oh, he's safe. He's with his people. He's with the Israelites. They reflect God and his glory and his goodness, right? Wrong. Something very horrific happens to this traveler and his traveling companion. You will have to read this week to find out what that is. But then the traveler does something gruesome, but he does it in an effort to wake up the 12 tribes of Israel, to send them a message that would shock them into doing something, because it was this act, it was this event that showed the Israelites how deep and dark into sin that they had fallen. You see, their abandonment of God had affected their tactics in war, their relationships, how they related to one another, and their religion. It had corrupted every area of their lives. And this act, towards the end of this week's reading, is meant to wake up the Israelites to the depth of the darkness. But we don't stay in the darkness this week. Even in the midst of the darkness, God is still at work. And you will end this week's reading with a ray of hope, a ray of light, a ray of God's goodness, his glory, and his holiness in the life of someone who isn't even an Israelite. Someone who is not born into the Israelite community, but someone, nevertheless, who chooses to chase after the God of the Israelites. This person chooses God as their God. And I want you to look and learn and see how God uses this person to reflect his goodness, his glory, and fulfill his purposes in the midst of the darkness. There are a few questions I have for you this week as you're reading. The first one is, we talked about how the Israelites' abandonment of God had reflected their tactics in war, their relationships, and their religion. Please look at and describe the characteristics of the Israelites in these three areas. Contrast them with how they approached war, relationships, and religion during Joshua's time, and the way that God had instructed them to approach war, relationships, and religion in the law. Number 2, what characterizes the grandsons of Moses, Aaron, and Rahab? Tell me about each one of those grandsons and what characterizes them. Number 3, how do the 12 tribes respond when this horrific event happens that I referred to a couple of minutes ago. When this horrific event happens, how do the 12 tribes respond to it? What do they do? During this 13th week of the Chase Challenge, I want to continue to challenge you to chase after God. Don't chase after the things that everyone around us is chasing after. All the people around us, our culture, our neighbors, even our friends. Let's fight to acknowledge God, keep Him first place, and to continuously remind ourselves and our children of His mighty power, what He has done in the past, and what He's doing today, and then His purposes for our lives and for our future. We need to be intentional about those things so that we don't abandon Him, we don't forget Him in the busyness of our culture and in all of the distractions that tempt us to draw away from Him. So keep chasing after the one who is chasing after you. I'll see you next week.